Well, thank you very much. I hope everyone had a wonderful lunch. We're here to talk about more about the Middle East, jihadist movements, Islamist movements, and politics. And let me just quickly introduce the fellow panelists. The one all the way to the left is Alex Vatanka. Alex has been one of the leading scholars on the Middle East in Washington, but also influential in Europe for probably at least 2 decades now. And he's recently written about Iran's influence in Yemen, and his current project involves dealing with Iranian politics, Iranian ideology, Iranian factions, and I would keep out for his forthcoming book on Iran, because it'll probably be the premier book covering that country available to people interested in Iran and the Middle East. Next to Alex, we have Michael Ryan. Michael has also been working for his career on the Middle East, Egypt, Islamist politics, and jihadist groups. And his book, Decoding Al-Qaeda Strategy, is really a treasure. I think it reflects the best that Jamestown Foundation analysts aspire to. It's filled with tons of primary source documents and the references. And the book is really based on analyzing those to understand what Al-Qaeda's mission is. So it's going to be a timeless book for understanding that group, especially as it seeks to take the place as the #1 jihadist group over ISIS, now that ISIS is on the ropes. And interestingly, in my own work on Boko Haram, I was looking for a book by a jihadist that was written in the 1990s about an Algerian, Abu Musa al-Suri, who knew a fellow Algerian who went to Nigeria and lost documents in 1996. And I figured this was relevant for my own work, and so I contacted Michael for that document, and Michael, of course, had it. So Michael is really someone who has a true archive of jihadist documents, and he uses that in his analysis. And then right next to me is Rafid Jaboori. He's a frequent contributor to Jamestown publications, formerly working as a journalist, and I recommend that you continue to keep out for his publications because they're among the sharpest that you'll find. So in this regard, I'd like to turn over the floor to Alex to go first.
All right. Good afternoon, and thank you, Jacob, for that very, very kind, almost too kind introduction. But I appreciate it very much. And I didn't even ask how much time we have, but you can just give me a couple of minutes. Yeah. I wanted to talk about Iranian policies in Iraq and Syria, and then Glenn asked me to bring in the latest protests in Iran and what I make of it. And I think actually you can make a good case of linking the two, and I'll try, but I'd love to have the discussion and your kind of input. But I think you can make a case of linking what's happening in Iran to Iran's ability to, if you will, stay the course in the region. I'll throw some facts and figures and I think realities, and we can take it from there. But let me start off with asking this simple question. Why was the crackdown so much harsher this time around with the protests that began on the 15th of November compared to the ones we've seen earlier? And I'll give you, again, some data here that I think is interesting. To me, the regime had prepared for this for a long time. You could say they had over-prepared for this because it got out of hand. In some of the local, in some of the localities around the country, we saw far more people killed in other places. So this was not something that came down from a central government point of view necessarily. This was at times or being influenced by commanders on the local level. Give you an example. Most of the casualties happened in the southwest, in the province of Khuzestan, where Iran's oil industry is concentrated, but also happens to be home to ethnic Iranian Arabs. You have something like 115, 120 people killed in a small town of, it's called Mashar on the Persian Gulf. About 10 times as many that were killed in Tehran. Ask yourself the question, was that a case of being over-prepared? I think that you can make that argument. They were over-prepared because the area is so sensitive. It's home to the oil and the petrochemical industry, or a good part of it. It's also a region that has historically gotten a lot of attention from the Gulf Arab states. If you believe Iranian assertions, they get money, they get weapons from the Gulf states. We can speculate when I say who Gulf states are, but that's the Iranian claim. In other words, the Iranians cracked down those places in the country where they felt the national security, never mind the national security, the integrity of Iran as a nation state was at stake. Now, if I put it to you the way I just did, you can then say, well, Iran had a good case to crack down hard. They're about to lose their country. Witness the disintegration of the country. Of course, they're going to come in hard at the protesters. But you could also make the counter argument and say the reason why they had so much protest and so many people killed, not just this time around, but in recent years on a number of occasions, is because we're talking about a regime that's detached itself from its own people. And I think that's really at the heart of the matter. We can discuss as much as we want the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, but as an analyst who's been watching Iran for the last 20 years, I cannot but help thinking this is all about structural problems inside the regime, and there's so much the U.S. or others can do to shape what's going on. They had these protests taken on, going back to Glenn's question about what really happened. They had them happen, unlike Iraq or Lebanon, where you had them in concentrated areas to begin with, they had them occur simultaneously around the country. But the Iranian regime also faced the following. They faced young, mostly young men, a younger demographic, throwing stones at the security forces. You're talking 200, 300,000 basis of some of the data, across a nation of 82 million. What the regime feared was that those stone-throwing teenagers would be joined by the long list of other groups in society that have grievances against the regime, from your workers to your pensioners to your teachers and so on. So they decided to go in heavy and kill as many as they needed to bring this to a quick end, and they did. Within a week, they had brought it to an end. Compare that to Iraq or elsewhere in the region that's been going on for months. And to give you a comparison in terms of casualties, in the span of 7 days, they killed twice as many as they killed after 2009 Green Opposition movement erupted, which took 7 months to bring to an end. In 1 week of 7 days, they killed twice as many as they killed in 7 months back in 2009. They arrested twice as many. So clearly the regime is nervous. Clearly the regime has a sense of being besieged. It doesn't know what the Trump administration maximum pressure campaign, where it ends. It doesn't want to take any chances. It does suspect its neighboring states to have had a role in this, although they don't want to mention names too often because they don't want to burn bridges. The other thing that I thought was interesting for me was within a couple of weeks, the regime has started backpedaling, if you will, calling many of those killed innocent bystanders. They didn't know what was going on. They were just collateral damage. This is a recognition that they got it wrong. They overkilled, and this is going to come back to haunt them eventually. They're trying to do damage control, if you will. So what is the long-term impact from these protests? Let me just go through a list of points that I think might be worth us paying attention to. So far, no public sign of remorse by the top officials in the Islamic Republic. You've had Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, come out and say some of these people killed were innocent. In fact, he's called some of them martyrs, which in terms of what that means in practical terms, if you're labeled a martyr, you're entitled to a stent pension, and you get all sorts of perks from the state. This is one way of buying off the family of those obviously upset by the loss of their loved ones. The regime hasn't to this day come out with a figure of how many people were killed, which is quite astonishing. This is the same regime that was able to turn off the internet for a country of 82 million people, literally overnight. But they haven't been able to come up with a figure of how many people were killed. It is a huge embarrassment to them. It is a huge embarrassment. A lot of people are starting to talk about this starting to look like 1978, when things started brewing, and within a few months, the Shah of Iran was gone. I don't want to go that far, but I hear people talk about it along those lines. Instead, the regime narrative early on was this was a job well done, that they cracked it down. Unlike the one Revolutionary Guards general, in fact, referred to the French being unable to put down their protesters. He said, we've done a much better job than the French. Look at us, very almost proud. But that was early in the post-protest period. Now, they're more in the sense of remorse, if you will, and what I mentioned before, this notion that this was a case of overkill. Certainly, if the regime's conclusion is that the only way forward is to crack down, I think you can expect more such crackdowns occurring, and they can only get bigger, if not bloodier. Another impact from the recent protest is that the certainly activism among the Iranian opposition was greater. But you also had this very glaring lack of unity, in fact, when it came to what the opposition wants. So the opposition are almost on the same page, both inside of Iran and those in the very large and dynamic diaspora, 5, 6, 7 millions around the world, depending on whose number you want to take. But often very influential and heavily involved in the messaging campaign. So they were all against what was happening in Iran. But did anybody see what the common vision is? Is there a leader? To this day, the Iranian opposition inside Iran, with the protesters as well, is leaderless. We have the Shah's son, Prince Reza Pahlavi, who lives in Washington, D.C., who's been very active in recent years. But his presence alone creates division among the opposition. So in this town, when there was a demonstration for the protesters, there were two groups of people, one standing in front of the White House, another group gathering DuPont Circle. The ones who did not want to rally around Reza Pahlavi did not want to be with the ones from the White House, which, you know, it tells you in terms of the strength of the opposition and how far they still have to go. But at the same time, another real lesson from this time around was the focus on the man Ayatollah Khamenei. And I have gone as far as saying this is the end of those people who had hoped for gradual reform in Iran. That you can argue that certainly the younger generation of Iranians have come to the conclusion that this is not a regime that can be reformed, what it's its domestic policies, what it does in the region. That came much faster than I thought. That came much faster than I thought. All right. Let me switch over quickly to an issue of US and then the region. The US was not blamed in this. The Iranian regime did not point to the US as the party involved, which is quite interesting, which tells you they think they need to leave the door open because they want to have talks with the United States. And Rouhani, the president of Iran, has been asking for this meeting, hopefully happening in the next week or so. He's going to Tokyo. You just had a so-called prisoner exchange. So the Iranians did not want to blame the United States, probably because of lack of evidence. I don't see any signs of the U.S. being involved on the ground to that extent. But it's also, even if the U.S. was involved, the Iranians want to pretend that didn't happen because they need to talk to the Trump administration about what to do with the sanctions. And the Iranians, by the way, unlike places in Hong Kong and so forth, there was no sort of asking for U.S. support as such. There was no asking for U.S. support. So those people who are making this case that this is all about the United States, I think, are exaggerating. This is very much an Iranian fight, and it's between these various forces inside Iran and in the diaspora to choose where the country is going to go from here onwards. Let me turn to the region, because a lot of those grievances, if you listen to the slogans of the protesters, what are they shouting about? They're shouting about corruption, they're shouting about unaccountability by the regime, and all sorts of other things, but including foreign policy. A lot of the slogans are about get out of Syria. What are you doing in Lebanon? What are you doing in Yemen? What are we doing building up missiles in Syria against Israel? Isn't that a fight we chose to start off with? So I think that's the big challenge for the Revolutionary Guards, who over the last, and I'm going to have to condense my remarks here because I can't finish what I had written here, so let me just give you a summary of my thoughts. They cannot today argue that they are in Syria to prevent some sort of existential threat to the Iranian nation the way they could say in 2012, 13, and 14. Certainly when ISIS marched toward Mosul in the summer of 2014 and we're only a few hundred kilometers away from the Iranian border, the Iranian regime could argue that we got a bunch of extremely anti-Iranian, extremely anti-Shia fanatics on the loose. They're coming towards us. We need to mobilize. And they did. But today ISIS is defeated. And by the way, back in 2011-12, when the Arab Spring happened, the price of oil per barrel was about $111 so. In 2011, Iran had $100 billion in oil revenue. What is Iran's oil revenue today? What I'm saying is there's far less money for the Iranians to spend, and the whole logic behind being in the region as part of what they continue to call forward defense, that logic is somewhat gone. It doesn't sell as well anymore. And I think that's, again, a big challenge for the regime. I don't want to talk because we can get into this, but to be fair, you could make the argument that, you know, I'm often accused to sort of go after the Islamic Republic. I don't have the ability to see how the world looks like from their perspective. This notion that there are 60, 70,000 American troops around Iran's borders. There are dozens of American military bases around Iran's borders. That all of Iran's rivals can buy missiles or anything they want, and nobody says anything, but as soon as the Iranians do something, the world gets on them. All those might be true. That's not for me right now to sort of debate. What I'm saying is, put that aside. I'm asking the simple question, can you continue being on the path of promoting the so-called forward defense? Can you be in Lebanon, in Syria, and Iraq when the local populations of those countries are not necessarily welcoming you anymore? And your own people at home are saying, please, Ayatollah Khamenei, turn around and focus on Iran. Spend the fewer dollars we have, thanks to the sanctions, spend that money at home. Iran has plenty of impoverished pockets that need some of that money. So let me just stop there. Maybe I should just say that we can get into the Q&A, but I just want to say, last word on this is, I do remember every morning when I get up to take my humility pill. So I'm not in the business of predicting the Islamic Republic's downfall tomorrow, next month, or next year. I don't know. What I do know is they have never been tested like this before. And they have never had the first generation revolutionaries who came to power in 1979 had to answer for the policies the way they've had to the last few weeks and years. In that sense, maximum pressure has made them, forced them to choose which way do we want to go. The ideology, because what they're doing in Syria and Iraq and Lebanon is far more to do with the ideology than the national interest of Iran. And that's a hard one for them to choose. But the other thing is, it's a regime that has always in its history been very stubborn. It could have ended the Iran-Iraq war within a couple of years, but the war lasted 8 years because there was this stubborn attitude in Tehran that we can prevail. But while they are stubborn, this is not a suicidal regime. So when the pressure is on, they do have the ability and are willing to make compromises because above all, survival of the regime is the most important for them. Not what happens to Assad or Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon, but what happens in Tehran. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll have time for questions, of course, to follow on Iran and then compare the synergies between Iran and then the topics that Michael and Rafid will cover. So, Michael, you're on the clock.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. I'm going to harken back to what Hassan Abbas said about a Western way and an American way, that the Americans like to get right to the point. So what I'm going to say is that Al-Qaeda has not gone away. It's just rebuilding. And ISIS has not gone away. They're also rebuilding. And then I'm going to say a little history lesson for you, go through a history lesson to prove just one part, one corner of why I think Al-Qaeda has not gone away and will not go away soon. So today I want to talk about how the sparsely populated Egyptian Sinai became Al-Qaeda's unlikely strategic hub between Asia and Africa. Last year I spoke about how ISIS and Al-Qaeda would organize themselves after the fall of the physical Caliphate and the eventual fall of Al-Qaeda's holdings in Syria I spoke about how both organizations would revert to guerrilla warfare, augmented by small and single-cell tactics, assisted strategically by weaponized preachers. I predicted that both would operate in the gray zone below the threshold that would provoke an overwhelming American military response. Both organizations, I opined, would engage in regional rebranding, retooling, and regrouping. In an interesting speech, Zawahiri described his midterm goals as replacing the fallen Ottoman Caliphate with an Islamic emirate composed of some 50 linked entities stretching from Central Asia through the Central Arab lands to the Atlantic coast. Today, for the sake of time, I want to focus on Al-Qaeda, which was ultimately more successful in Egypt as a whole, although both organizations are following exactly the same tactics and very much some of the same strategy as well in Egypt. But I thought that Zawahiri's speech was an unusual offering towards the fighters of ISIS, who could see this Islamic emirate as a step closer to the caliphate that they've just had to give up. So it took years for Al-Qaeda to build the Islamic resistance infrastructure, using their terms, in the Sinai, and to connect it to international jihadist underground networks. Today, I will describe 5 steps in the creation of this infrastructure. The first is what I call religious conversion. By that, I mean the process of Wahhabi preaching and outreach, which predated the formation of Al-Qaeda, and when merged with the jihadist concept of the Egyptian Sayyid Qutb, led to the creation of the Jihadi Salafist ideology and the existence of weaponized radical jihadi theologians inside Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. In the case of Egypt, this process involved the conversion of some small number of traditional Muslims in Sinai and Nilotic Egypt to the Wahhabi-style Salafism, not the official government-approved Salafism but of Saudi Arabia, but extremist Wahhabism, which was often promoted outside of Saudi Arabia. Wahhabi-style Salafism did not exist in the Sinai before the 1970s, when the Salafist outreach from the Gulf began in earnest, and included takfiri, that is, calling anybody who doesn't agree with them non-Muslim, takfiri elements. Before that time, the Bedouin tribesmen in the Sinai traditionally practiced a conservative form of Islam, but highly influenced by Sufism. Over the decades, Wahhabi-style preachers and mosques spread from the Egyptian Delta into the Sinai. Second, a jihadist radicalization. Jihadi radicalization proceeded along 2 lines: radicalized elements in the Egyptian Delta and Gaza into the vulnerable populations in the Sinai, and in a parallel movement within the Egyptian military, which ultimately affected Sinai as well as mainland Egypt, Libya, and beyond. One of the earliest actors to bring jihadist concepts and books to the Sinai was a man named Khalid Messiah. He was a member of a prominent Sawarka tribe. Messiah was a 1999 graduate from a dental school in Sharqiya province in the Egyptian Delta. But during his college years, he became radicalized in part by reading the foundational jihadist text of Muhammad Abdus Salam Faraj and Imam Ash-Sharif, also known as Dr. Fadl. Faraj was a founder of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. He was an associate of the young Zawahiri and was executed for his role in the assassination of President Sadat in 1981. Dr. Fadl, for his part, wrote one of the earliest and most influential religiously based justifications for Al-Qaeda-style violence. So Messiah, returning to the Sinai, preached this radical form of Islam in the local mosques, which were now much more receptive to a jihadi Salafist message, and began to organize jihadist cells. He did not come to the attention of Egyptian state security because it focused on violent groups, not radical ideology. He was later given credit for helping found At-Tawhid wal Jihad, which had branches in both Sinai and Gaza. This group was to morph into a shadow group in the Sinai, Ansar Beit al-Maqdis. Musayyad was killed in a firefight at a security roadblock in 2005 after being associated with a number of attacks against isolated Egyptian and Israeli targets in South Sinai between 2004 and 2005. The attacks were to continue after his death in 2006 until Mubarak's massive security purge in the Sinai had its effect. There's every reason to believe that Al-Qaeda had a clandestine presence in addition to its strong influence in Sinai and Gaza at this early stage. Jihadi elements had infiltrated the Egyptian military as early as the 1970s, leading up to the assassination of President Anwar Sadat during the military parade, as we all know, in 1981. The assassination was to inspire President Mubarak's strong security crackdown within the military. Nevertheless, such elements were to reemerge as Al-Qaeda gained international prominence. Two Egyptian researchers, Maher Faghali and Salahuddin Hassan, writing in Arabic and with support of the Egyptian military intelligence, described how one Egyptian army officer, Tariq Abolazem, became disillusioned after being chosen for a highly competitive course in American military training. He asked himself the question, why are they so advanced and we are so behind? He began to buy the works of Sayyid Qutb and searched the internet for the words of Osama bin Laden and the works of Abu Musab al-Suri, among others. He founded a radical study group within the military, the Egyptian military, with other like-minded officers. I'm trying to spare you a lot of these names, so forgive me, but one of these was a talented young special forces officer whose name was Hisham Ashmawi. Hisham Ashmawi was later to become the leader of the military wing of Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis in Sinai before founding the Murabitun in Syria. And I'll return to him. Third was rebranding and regrouping local groups. The Mubarak government waged and won the great struggle against powerful jihadist groups like Gamal al-Islamiyya and Egyptian Jihad during the 1990s, when many of the jihadists died and more were imprisoned. However, a number of smaller independent jihadi Salafist groups emerged intact at the turn of the century. Many of these groups were located within the Delta, where Musayyad was. The most dangerous of these was the one in Alexandria, with small clandestine fighting brigades peppered throughout a number of governments between Alexandria and Egypt and Cairo and beyond. They had names like Gundallah, Soldiers of Allah, and Jaish al-Islam, Army of Islam. Such small groups and single-cell terrorists were sympathetic to Al-Qaeda and shared its ideology without really being pledged to it. All that changed overnight with the fall of the Mubarak government, the massive escape from the Egyptian prisons, an infiltration of Al-Qaeda elements from Sinai into Sinai from Gaza at the same time when the bulk of the Egyptian government security forces returned to Cairo to deal with the uprisings there. It was as if dozens of new groups appeared unhindered overnight, some of them with old names and some with new names. One of bin Laden's former associates, Ramzi al-Mawafi, escaped Cairo to become the leader of Ansar al-Jihad, the fighting wing of what would become Al-Qaeda in the Sinai Peninsula. At approximately that time, a former Egyptian soldier that I mentioned before, Hisham Ashmawi, fled to Benghazi, where he would pledge allegiance to Al-Qaeda and fight with Ansar al-Sharia against Gaddafi with other Egyptians as well. Something the Libyan government was trying to tell us at the time, but we said no, there are no Egyptians there. Meanwhile, at the same time, Zawahiri called on his old Afghan colleague, now based in London, whose name was Abul Basit Azuz, to establish a camp for Al-Qaeda jihadists in eastern Libya near Benghazi. When Gaddafi fell, a number of the Egyptian jihadists who had traveled there traveled from Libya through the Sahel to fight in Mali and other places in the Sahel in an unprecedented way with Tuaregs, which usually hate Arabs. The Egyptians, of course, weren't to stay there. When President Morsi's government fell, Ashmawi traveled to the Sinai, where he became the leader of the military wing, as I mentioned, of Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, which I would note that many Sinai-based jihadists, including Ashmawi, became battle-hardened also by training in the Syrian and Iraqi jihadist wars. So they managed to somehow travel, in all this travels, actually I got 5 minutes, so I'm going to start talking really fast. I'm on number 4 out of 5. Al-Qaeda's organization and structure in the Sinai. In August 2013, an intercepted international conference call between Zawahiri and some 20 leaders of regional Al-Qaeda affiliates was leaked to the press. Among the things revealed was the existence of the Al-Qaeda affiliate formally in Sinai and the reality of post-Bin Laden structure, which appeared to reflect the thinking of Abu Musab al-Suri during the period from 2014 to 2016. During the period from 2014 to 2016, Egypt suffered some 1,165 terrorist attacks. This was unprecedented, and they were both in Egypt itself, Nilotic Egypt, and in the Sinai, and some into Israel as well. Well, I'll mention one, which was the most spectacular attacks, was on the Al-Farafra oasis, which, if you know, in Egypt's western desert, is very far from anything else in Egypt without any roads connecting it, and it was forced from Libya, and they did it just like the attack on our Benghazi facility. They sent a little feeler attack in of a few men, and then they came back in a few days with 25, where they killed any number of people remotely from groups giving the directions in the Sinai, all the way onto the other side of Egypt near the Libyan border. And it was so serious a loss of prestige that Egypt declared 3 days of mourning for the soldiers and civilians that were killed, and Ashmawi became a marked man. And I'll just briefly say that Ashmawi also, when he returned to the Sinai before this attack I just mentioned, later, of course, we know Al-Bayt al-Maqdis pledged allegiance to ISIS and became ISIS in the Wilayat in Sinai. Ashmawi left and formed something he called Al-Murabitun, and he went on into Libya and continued operations there. The remarkable thing about that is in those operations, he managed to attack both through in the east and in the west of Egypt. They're very long distances to find their ways back up into the Nile corridor and attack there, and also in Sinai. It was amazing, which gets me basically to my number 5, which is logistics. Al-Qaeda in the Sinai developed the links to move fighters and trainers and equipment between Libya and the Sinai. They moved vetted fighters, which were vetted by mosques, Al-Qaeda's way, vetted fighters for training in and out of Syria and Iraq, and established logistical ties between Sinai through Libya and the Atlantic coast. They trained small cells in safe houses in Sinai Desert and mountain camps, urban safe houses and in camps in Libya. Al-Qaeda used traditional smuggler routes into Egypt from Libya and the north and southern routes. They used smuggling routes between Gaza and the Sinai, and on occasion into Israel. They were able to move people and equipment west and south from Libya to the Atlantic. And so basically, while Al-Qaeda under Zawahiri mastered the art of operating in the gray zone vis-a-vis the United States, the organization suffered setbacks in the latest round against local powers in Egypt and Libya. But Al-Qaeda is still very active in Africa, along with ISIS, and the Sahel. And they've got radicalized smuggling lines which still exist connecting all these areas. Moreover, guerrilla groups in Sinai are still active today, and clandestine small cells and individual jihadist terrorist cells still exist, and they will emerge and perhaps expand later. The lines between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, in my opinion, are blurring in Africa, and there's every reason to believe, therefore, that jihadi Salafist threat to the region in Europe and perhaps the United States will appear even more virulently after several years, emerging when we least expect it. If the past is prologue, and I believe it is, it will happen. And the last thing I will mention is that, and it's just a slight blurb for the kind words about my now old book, about basically documents that Al-Qaeda studies is they found these books. They found the books, the Egyptian military, in the Sinai, and that's what the locals have been studying. So their strategy is very well established, and we should expect more of it. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Michael. And now Rafid will help bring us in between Iran and Egypt towards the Iraq and Syrian theaters.
Nice link.
Hello, everybody. My name, again, is Rafid Jaboori, and I'm a Jamestown fellow. I'll be talking about instability in Iraq and its effect on ISIS and the regional but also global security. So since October the 1st, Iraq has been witnessing possibly the largest street protest in its history, apart from the 1991 Shia uprising. More than 500 people have been killed. More than 20,000 were injured, some of them with permanent disability. And it's still ongoing. Leaderless protests calling for reform, end of corruption, and sectarianism. That's, of course, angered, caused worry and anxiety and angry, not only by the Iraqi government, but also, of course, by its main regional backer, Iran. You all hear me well? You hear me well? Thank you. So I'll be talking a bit about Iraqi politics, because it matters to not only to the stability of Iraq, but also to regional but global security as well. What happens in Iraq is very important. What happens in the Iraqi politics is very important and significant. And sometimes,
Too close to the mic.
all right, okay. And sometimes people draw the misguided lessons. So, for example, people who know Nouri al-Maliki, who was a prime minister of Iraq between 2006 and 2014, most of them, at least in this room, have negative opinion about him, right? But he was supported for his first term in 2006 directly by a US president, George W. Bush. And in 2010, he was again supported directly by a US president for a second term. And back then in 2010, there was a political stalemate. Maliki narrowly lost the elections. But then the US administration thought that actually Maliki meant stability. And we're talking about stability and instability here. So it was, from the administration's perspective, better to keep Maliki in position in order to facilitate the US withdrawal from Iraq. So 2 years on, the media started talking about, how bad Maliki was and his crackdown and sectarian policies, and then he became the one to blame about the rise of ISIS. Some of that is true, but the US involvement in supporting him is not well reported, remembered, and recorded nowadays. So that's very important, how to intervene in Iraqi politics and what to learn from that. The US policy, the US handling of the ongoing crisis is a little bit, so far, a little bit more rational and a little bit promising. There has been some clear messaging to the Iraqi government. So the Iraqi government first response was very bloody. The internet was shut down, and there was, crackdown in central Baghdad that intimidated some of the protesters, but did not stop the protests. The U.S. has been, this administration has been directing its messages so far in a clever way, in coordination with the UN messaging, which is very important. So there was calls to respect the human rights and respect the media, not to be too much harsh on people and the media. But of course, that did not stop the violence from the Iraqi government and from the Iranian-backed Iraqi Shia militias. But again, that's what we see now, so far at least, is a consistent U.S. policy. Not enough, of course, of the people who think that the U.S. might seize the opportunity and decided to confront Iran and Iraq. And then let me share the final assessment of Alex in his talk. He was talking in the Iranian context about the unprecedented challenge that the Iranian regime has been facing. In the Iraqi context, I share that. Let me put it in the Iraq context. This could well be a turning point, because the Iraq war led to, of course, many things, but primarily led to the rise of the Iranian power in the Middle East, or empowerment in the Middle East. Iran became the dominant force in many countries, but primarily in Iraq, of course. And the U.S. acknowledged all the administrations since 2003 acknowledged that role for Iran and Iraq. Now, it's possible that this is a turning point when Iran might at least lose some of that influence and domination in Iraq, because as we all know that most of the protests are happening within the Shia community in Iraq by the Shia poor people who are protesting against Iran, and you can't, that cannot, it's very clear how the resentment against Iran is high in Iraq. The Iranian consulate in the Shia holy city of Najaf was set to fire not once but 3 times during this ongoing crisis, 3 times. And of course, in also the other holy Shia city of Karbala, the Iranian consulate was attacked. So why is that happening? Primarily social causes. This was not against the Iranian accusation that there was an American-sponsored conspiracy. This has deep social economic roots and causes. The system in Iraq, the power sharing system, which of course, again, the U.S. administration indulged themselves to think that is going to lead to less violence and less political tension, led only to patronage and corruption, or primarily to that. So you have people who benefited from the system, but many did not, and many of those who were unprivileged were from the Shia majority, supposedly ruling the country, at least leading or dominating its politics. So that's what we see now. Iran is so angry, so everything is a conspiracy. And of course, Ayatollah Khamenei asked the Iraqi people early on during this crisis to, not to hesitate to crack down on the riots. But the other Ayatollah, Ali Sistani, did not, actually was against any harsh policies against the crackdown. And not only because he was the good Ayatollah, but also because he realized the resentment within his own Shia community. So if Sistani, hypothetically, was gonna be against the protest, much of the resentment was gonna, be directed against him as well. He was gonna be considered as, a real backer of the whole political class. And the whole political class is being condemned by the Iraqi protesters. That's why it's very hard to find a foreseeable solution now. There's no clear leadership of the protest, and the Iraqi regime does not seem to be able to fix itself and introduce real reform. So that's the scale of the crisis. The Iraqi Shia militias, of course, were spearheading the crackdown campaigns. And the Iraqi, Iran-backed Shia militias were on the rise since 2003, of course, but more notably since 2014 and the war against ISIS. There were, of course, economic entities that they built and income and wealth that they have been generating as part of controlling territory, but also influencing the politics. Politically, they won. They came in second in the 2018 parliamentary elections. Their political arm, so they gained political positions. Of course, also they control territory, mainly not only in the Shia areas, but in the Sunni areas too. So those areas that where we saw ISIS driven out of are mostly controlled by the Shia militias under the umbrella group, the Popular Mobilization Units, the PMU. And that also means political influence, but also wealth generation during very, out of very controversial means and policies. In the media and the way they shaped the narrative in Iraq 2014, the Shia militias were on the rise too. Iran invested so much actually in supporting media organizations that promoted the Shia militias, and now that all is coming to question because Iran was so disappointed by how poorly they did in terms of winning the hearts of minds of their own Shia constituency. Because the anger and the resentment that we have seen, as I said, is unprecedented. ISIS, so an opportunity in all that. What Iran saw as a conspiracy, ISIS saw as a real crisis, genuine crisis. So in their narrative now, Maliki lost power or was removed from his position because of the fall of Mosul. Not completely wrong, yeah. And his successor, Prime Minister Abadi, lost his position because of the economic crisis that was caused by the cost of the war on ISIS. And this government of Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi, who recently resigned but still a caretaker prime minister, was formed actually to serve the interest of the Shia militias in ISIS narrative, which is again not completely wrong, but it's very important for them, that this situation is developing and the type of opportunity that it represents for them. They also believe that there is a crisis within the Shia community, not only about the economic situation, but also the Shia faith itself. So that's also part of the Shia-Sunni ongoing rivalry and conflict. And it's for them, even if the Iranian, they think ISIS think that the Iranian will eventually, just like they did in Syria, will eventually be able to suppress the protest. But even if they did, according to ISIS, this was going to be a very important episode in an ongoing series that will lead eventually to the demise of the Iraqi regime, or the Iraqi-led regime and the Iranian-backed regime. And I highlighted the PMU, the Iraqi Shia militias' control over large parts of the Sunni areas in Iraq. So now, what happens if they decided to actually focus their military existence and deploy more people back to Baghdad and the Shia south, where the protests are ongoing, and where there is a possibility of a Shia civil war, an intra-Shia civil war? What's going to happen? According to ISIS, that might lead to the former Sahwa, those were the American-backed Sunni fighters, to reintroduce themselves as actually the alternative of the Shia militias to control the Sunni areas and confront ISIS. And ISIS thinks that ISIS has been making plans for that. And they think that as they failed, as the Sahwa, the pro-American, American-backed Sunni fighters failed in 2008, 2009, after the Americans let them down and handed them over to the Shia militia, to the Shia-led government of Nur al-Maliki in Iraq, they will fail again. So they were ready for any possibility of a Sunni fighters, Sahwa resurgence. On the killing of Baghdadi, ISIS says, their rivals were happy when Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi was killed in 2006, but then, of course, under Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, his successor, according to them, many good things happen according to the world, many horrible things happen. And of course, there was more violence in general, whether in Iraq and elsewhere. And then everyone was happy when Abu Umar al-Baghdadi was killed in 2010, but then look what happened next. There was under Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, there was the rise of the Islamic State. The Islamic State in Iraq became the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and then it became the Islamic State as a caliphate, which has, which held territory in Iraq and Syria, but also inspired many beyond those two countries. And those branches are very important now, whether in Central Africa, West Africa, Southeast Asia, Afghanistan, Iraq itself, Syria and Yemen, and elsewhere. So very interesting times ahead. No easy answers in my conclusion, no easy answers, but again, it's very important to learn at least the past lessons from Iraq. The protesters are against, have been in general very peaceful. They were calling to end corruption and sectarianism, but there is no foreseeable political solutions. The UN is trying to play a role. The US is supporting that. Ayatollah Sistani is not for the Iranian way of handling the situation with the harsh policies of the government and the Shia militias, and the struggle continues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafid. One observation that I have is that, after decades of jihadists trying to overthrow the Mubarak regime, it ended up being protests that overthrew him. And then the US got involved with Morsi, and then got involved with Sisi, and then got involved with the whole mess. Now here we have protest movements rocking Iran and Iraq now, and it doesn't seem like the US is trying to put its fingers in there too much. It seems to have a more prudent approach, including even being quieter than it was during the Green Movement period in Iran. So just before we open up to questions from the audience, I wanted to hear any of your reactions about whether if the US is indeed letting these processes work out more for themselves organically, and not putting its fingers in, and whether that might be wise or not. If any of you want to take that up.
Well, I mean, since you mentioned Egypt, I think that I think we're wise not to be more involved than we are, but we don't really have a choice because the Egyptians don't want us in there, and the Egyptians have decided that their approach to the Egyptian military has decided, and President Sisi, that their approach to counterterrorism is not ours. It's more akin to Russian. It's kind of a Chechnya account. You kill them all, or you put them all in jail, or a combination. And that works. That's very effective. Except it radicalizes the entire population. So that's what they've managed to do in the Sinai. And so it's the situation has gotten worse, even though they've been very successful in what they militarily in what they've done. But I'm glad we're not involved, because it would just be worse if we were involved.
Yeah, you might have noticed that during my talk, I potentially praised the Trump administration as opposed to the previous administration. Actually, I'm not into the politics of the administration, but the way the U.S. administration has been handling Iraq, in particular, during this crisis, has been very focused about a clear message. But again, it's a dilemma, because the United States owned the political system in Iraq. It created this political system in Iraq, a system where you listen to senior officials telling you that they are your friends, but again they are Iran's neighbors. So they have to always strike the balance. People who actually own their positions to sectarianism, but they would tell you that they are against, wholeheartedly share the resentment of the public against sectarianism. So it's a very curious situation to be in. I think if this administration managed to develop its position into a strategy that links human rights, respect for human rights, with the U.S. significant military support to the Iraqi government, that will be on the long term better for future relations between Iraq and the United States. But again, that's not easy, because The U.S. is completely focused on fighting ISIS in Iraq. And I would share, I think earlier, Michael Duran's observation earlier in the morning when he said the U.S. is deterred to attack Iran, but I would focus it more, I would put a focus more on Iraq than the Gulf or Saudi Arabia. Because in the situation of Saudi Arabia, when Iran attacked, in theory, the U.S. could support a nation state if it wants to retaliate and attack Iran. In Iraq, it's very complicated, and I don't think that many people would support America going to war again in Iraq, even if that war would be against Iran.
I just, Jacob, two comments from me on that one. I mean, you talked about U.S. policy. Frankly, I think you would find a lot of people, including myself, who are not really sure what the Trump administration's end goal on Iran are about. We all suspect really what the administration wants is regime change, but we don't see a coherent, or we haven't been able to see a coherent plan how to implement it. I mean, let's take the response to the protesters this time. The Trump administration and people close to the administration for a long time complained that President Obama missed an opportunity in 2009 to come to the aid of the Iranian protesters. But in fact, the Trump administration hasn't done much more. I mean, on the rhetorical level, yes, there's been a lot of support. We were excited when the U.S. ambassador in Germany said, we're going to keep the internet alive in Iran. Didn't really happen. So we were sitting here thinking, how much did the Trump administration actually do besides the sort of rhetorical support? And I'm not sure. And then on top of that, in the midst of all this, you got hostage exchanges, prisoner exchanges, and the notion of dialogue just being around the corner. If nothing else, this takes the oxygen out of the Iranian opposition because they don't know, they're constantly second-guessing themselves. What is the U.S. position? As I said in my remarks, U.S. position is not key in this, but it's a factor. And the fact that there is this sort of great unknown about where the U.S. wants to go. I can tell you in the Middle East, there's a big, well, almost a conspiracy theory of sorts that says the United States doesn't want to see regime change in Tehran. The United States wants to see a weakened Islamic Republic. There's a big difference. And you could debate that. Speaking of because I listened to my co-panelist here about terrorism, Iran does not have a terrorism problem in terms of what we just heard about Egypt and Iraq and so on in the past, because you don't have terror groups operating in Iran. The ones that are designated are state-run. The regime is pretty much associated with him. And so when we're talking about countering terrorism, Iran's countering terrorism strategy, you could have, in the last 40 years, the best case you could have made for an Iranian counterterrorism strategy is what they did in in Syria and Iraq against ISIS. You could call that a counterterrorism operation. But as I said again in my remarks, ISIS is gone. So what is Iran doing right now, building up the missile arsenal? It's not about counterterrorism. It's what I refer to as a bigger ideological mission, which is geopolitical in its nature. Terrorism is an instrument. Counterterrorism is an instrument. And I think that's fundamentally what the U.S. needs to deal with in confronting Iran. And I think that this administration is trying to do that, to force the Iranian regime to once and for all choose what they want to be and where they want to go.
Just quickly, a follow-up. It's not just perception, actually. The U.S. administration says clearly that it doesn't want regime change in Iran. The president says that clearly.
Great. Well, thank you. We have plenty of time for comments and questions from the crowd. We'll take one in the back, and then we'll come up in the front after.
Thanks. Mike Duran. My question's for Alex. Alex, I really enjoyed your comments.
Speak up, please.
Mike, we can't hear you up here. Can you speak into the mic, please?
My name is Mike Duran, and Alex, my question is for you. I really enjoyed your comments. Thank you. I was struck by what you said about the leadership of the demonstrations and the lack of clarity about the leadership. But I wonder if you could just go into a little bit more detail about that. It's very striking that you have these protests across the whole country, simultaneous, and yet no one can identify leadership. Can you talk about the interconnectivity between these protests, or do you think that there is a network with some kind of leadership somewhere Anything that you can say to give us insight into how something like this happens without an identifiable leader. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. Look, I would put it to you this way. In the case of the opposition leaders inside Iran, what you really are missing is, I would call it political courage. It's massively absent. I mean, people in this town, there are not that many left, but there are probably still folks who think the likes of Mohammad Khatami and, God forbid, Hassan Rouhani are the type of reformists that will change Iranian trajectory. Now, the reaction, Rouhani was as hardline as the Revolutionary Guards in justifying the crackdown. And Khatami said, if I have to choose between the survival of the regime and cracking down, I'll go for the survival of the regime. What I'm saying, Michael, is that reformism is pretty much dead. There is no notion that this reform can happen. If there will be Iranian concessions, don't look for moderates in Iran to give you concessions. Look to make concessions or get concessions from the hardliners, because they're really the only ones that matter. So get Qasem Soleimani to give you concessions. Don't look to Rouhani, because you're essentially wasting your time. And in the terms of the diaspora, you're right. There are smaller organizations, the MEKs of this world, some leftist organizations, remnants of the 1970s, who do have smaller numbers but are better organized. Trouble with the MEKs of this world is they have a deep level of support, but in a small group of people or in a small segment of Iranian diaspora opposition. They don't have the numbers on their side. And I don't even want to get into the history of, the complications of them having moved to Saddam's Iraq in the 80s and the fact that a lot of people haven't forgiven them. They're not an ideal opposition. The monarchists, to my mind, or those people around Reza Pahlavi, and I'm not an activist, I'm not going to argue for anyone, but if you are looking for a figurehead who, I mean, sometimes controversially I've said, well, look at Ayatollah Khomeini. Wasn't he a figurehead? He managed to rally from communists to everybody else in between around him. And 99% of those people didn't know what he stood for till it was too late. In the case of Reza Pahlavi, his challenge is to articulate and say, look, this is what I stand for. I am not looking for a major political role, but I do want to play the role of a transitional leader. I think that's totally fine for him to say. Again, there are folks in this town who don't want to hear about Reza Pahlavi just because he's lived in Potomac, Maryland, that disqualifies him. I think MEK has to play a role in the transition. I think the Reza Pahlavis, the communists, everyone. If you genuinely want a secular democratic Iran, the opposition needs to start show a lot more tolerance towards each other to begin with. And those inside Iran, although granted, their hands are tied. I mean, in Iran, self-censorship is what you need to do to survive. But at the same time, we shouldn't kid ourselves and hope for a big change to come from inside the ranks of the regime. I just don't see the evidence of that. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. One question from
Hi, I'm Kimberly Dvorak with the Committee on Responsible Foreign Policy, and my question really could be to anyone up there. This country is rightly concerned with terrorism happening in the Middle East, obviously, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, any number of groups. Yet we continue to stay in Afghanistan, where, I'm just going to read a few numbers, 31,000 people were killed over the last 18 years in Afghanistan. In Mexico, 2018, 30,000 people died. And this year, they're on par to go to about 40,000 people. Middle East is really far away. Most Americans don't even know where it is. Wouldn't it be more prudent, to use your word, to actually secure our northern and southern borders? And we know Hezbollah is helping the cartels build the tunnels underneath. Would that not be more prudent than saying that we have to fight these wars in the Middle East because otherwise we'll be fighting them here? So if we have secure borders and our visa system and we really vet people that come to this country, why are we not focusing on Mexico? They're our neighbor. So I don't see any news coverage on this, and I think the issue, these people are committing acts of terrorism themselves. They're beheading people, they're dismembering people, and they're doing, I would argue, more horrific acts than the terrorists in the Middle East. So if any of you have any ideas as to what maybe we should start shifting our our resources do.
Yes.
Thank you.
Right. So, any comments on whether the U.S. should consider, extricating itself more from the Middle East and more towards looking toward borderlines?
I'll just say one thing. It's not an either or. I mean, there are different problems and there are different ways of doing it. I'd also mention, I should just say this isn't fair, but my daughter-in-law is Mexican. My granddaughter is half Mexican, not Mexican-American, Mexican. They're very nice people. Their families are very nice people. There's a lot of really nice people in Mexico, and I don't think they're a threat to us. Securing the border is another matter, and there's many ways to do it, but that has nothing to do with the Middle East. And I also say that the people who radicalize in Al-Qaeda or in ISIS way inside the United States have been Americans. They haven't been people from, for the most part, from abroad. That they were here. They were American citizens, and they radicalized through a variety of different ways. And we've been very lucky that we don't have more of it. And I think it has to do more with American society and the way that we are, that they're not more successful. But I would say that and I'll stop here. That for the forever wars, we need to stop them being forever wars. What they should be is what they've always should have been is counterterrorism, and there are other big issues that have to do that have to do with war. But it shouldn't be any of the things we've been talking about today, I don't think. But it doesn't have anything to do with immigration, was my point.
And neither do the cartels that are killing 30,000 last year and on par for 40,000, and they're creating, they're working with terrorists to get them into our country illegally. Hence, we ought to be focusing on these issues, because if the terrorists aren't coming over here and they're Americans, then you're saying we really don't have much to do in the Middle East, because we don't have, it could be an economic interest for the country if we want to trade in oil and things of that nature. But for the most part,
I think you're concerned.
Yeah.
I have a comment, because I spent a number of years working on counter-narcotics.
Okay.
It's one of
Well,
my-
I'm from
my
San
mis-
Diego, so I also covered the cartels.
Yeah, but with counter-narcotics, I spent years dealing with counter-narcotics, trying to fund overseas actions which were fruitless. It's a simple economic thing. There's a demand here in the United States for drugs, and as long as there's that demand here, we're going to have cartels. The cartels would disappear if the demand for drugs in the United States were to end. So which end should we work on? Should we work on trying to kill cartel guys? That's fine. But as long as we have a desire for drugs in the United States, somebody's going to supply that need, because there's a lot of money to be made. And I would say that China is probably more to be blamed, along with a number of Americans, for some of the opioid crisis. So I think that it's, again, what I'm trying to say is, it's not primarily a border issue, because a lot of those things were flown in. But I'll stop there, because I'm prejudiced, because I spent so many years trying to work on the counter-narcotics with overseas options, which I don't think work.
Yeah, this is a conversation that can continue even on the sidelines. We have one question from over here, and then is there any other? Okay, we'll take two from this table, and then we'll do one more set before closing.
Hello, this is Danielle. I'm just an analyst. I had a question as far as where do you see ISIS's role in the current protests in Baghdad? As far as, do you see them becoming more involved, using it as an ability to give them more freedom of movement, especially with Post-Baghdadi?
So ISIS's following of the protests? Yeah. In Baghdad, yeah.
Not necessarily particularly in Baghdad, but of course, as I mentioned, they have been following the protests, and they have been preparing for the aftermath of this crisis. So we don't know what's going to happen exactly in Baghdad. The question now, are the protests going to turn more violent? Because so far they have been restrained and peaceful. When I mentioned the, setting fire to the Iranian consulate, and of course to several branches of Iraqi political parties, they were not targeting people. They were targeting buildings and symbols. But there were reports of incidents of killing people, lynching even today in Baghdad, earlier today in Baghdad, and weeks ago in the south. So there is I mean, that's of course will definitely help any Iranian-run strategy to shape the conflict in Iraq the way it shaped the conflict in neighboring Syria. So that's of course something to watch. But again, there is of course a cause for introducing genuine reform by the government in Iraq. And ISIS will of course remain a threat, whether with the ongoing protests or without them.
If I could just add, this is not directly to answer the question about ISIS in Baghdad, but since Iran's role in Iraq keeps coming up, look, you know, like the United States has discovered, nation building is very expensive. And this is where the Iranians are getting to right now in terms of in the Middle East. They're getting to the point that they might inherit, Assad is still in power. Iran is the top player in Syria. They're still a top player in Iraq. But they are also owners or co-owners. And those economies desperately needs money, and guess what? Iran doesn't have it. So they're sitting on top of ruins in often cases. And if they don't deliver services, Iran will be the one to be blamed. So what the Iranians have done over the last few years is try to come up with something alternative to economic well-being. In the case of Iraq, we've seen in the last few years the Iranian attempt to create a Shia militant Islamist identity among the Iraqi Shias. Not necessarily the idea of supreme leadership, but this sort of love for Shia Islam. And if you follow, I don't know if anybody in the room has followed the so-called Arba'in pilgrimage. This is sort of a Sunni version of the Hajj, going to Mecca. They go to holy sites. I think the walk is from Karbala to Najaf, or is it the other way around? It's 80-kilometer long. 3 million Iranians were sent to Iraq, and 15 million Iraqis took part in this year's Arba'in marches. So what are these marches for? To create a sort of pan-regional Shia identity, and the Iranian hope is they're going to be the ones to sort of be captain of that ship. Wonderful. Till the Iraqi soccer team beat the Iranian national team. I don't know where it was. I bring that up not as a joke, but the Iraqi celebrations look like the kind of victory parades in Paris in May of 1945. That's how happy the Iraqis were to have beaten Iran. And I can tell you, in Iran, they're sitting thinking, this whole Shia, pan-Shia identity project, this Persian-Arab divide is too white still for us to get over it through a couple of marches. So Iran has to justify the billions of dollars they're spreading around in the Arab world, money they have increasingly less of, because if they don't wake up to the reality, the Arab world could be in trouble for decades to come, and Iran does really want to be involved or not, because they got plenty of projects back home they could focus on to empower and improve the lives of their own people.
Thanks. I'll take this question here, and then we'll go for one more set. Yeah.
My name's John Hughes. That was kind of a perfect segue into my question. And what would your thoughts be on what Iran's approach is going to be in Lebanon, given how Hezbollah is kind of being squeezed and there's U.S. and French backing for Hariri to reform the government?
Yeah, I actually I don't sense Iranian panic about what's going on in Lebanon as much I've seen Iranian worries about what's going on in Iraq. In the case of Lebanon, you know, it seems to be, and I'm certainly not an expert on Lebanon, but it seems to be overall a case of lack of money and the distribution of money because of various factors. There's been plundering of the nation's wealth by various connected groups in society and so forth. In the case of Iraq, Iraq produces, if I'm not mistaken, something like 4.5 million barrels of oil a day. It's not lack of money in the case of Iraq. It's the system of governance that doesn't work. And you could argue that Iran, United States, and others have been guilty of that. I'd love to hear, Rafid, what you have to say about this. But in terms of Lebanon, I don't see Iranian panic. I think the Hezbollah still seems to be as popular as ever. I have read reports about how there's lack or shortage of money going to Hezbollah fighters, but that has been said for the last few years now, and we still haven't seen sort of a major shift in Hezbollah's posture at home domestically or, say, against Israel. In other words, I think the Iranians, like they did in 1990-91 with Taif agreement, the worst thing they have to do is to cut deals with other parties. They've done it before. They'll do it again. It might even include the United States. But they have that Shia constituency that they think they can hang on to, at least for now. Iraq is much more complicated, but I'll stop there.
Oh, yes, it is, of course. I was going to start my talk by saying actually the weeks before this uprising seemed to be the best time in Iraq since 2003 in terms of stability in Baghdad and other areas. But there have been always the root causes of resentment and instability. Corruption and the growing divide, essentially the growing divide between the rich and the poor. Before 2000, between 1990 and 2003, Iraq was, of course, subject to the UN sanctions, unprecedented in history. But there was a safety net for the poor. That started to diminish since 2003. So even the Shia, even the poor Shia, which belong, of course, to the community that dominates Iraqi politics since 2003, were alienated. And when the right moment came, not by an American-sponsored conspiracy, as the Iranian government believe and promote, but by genuine causes, that fake stability that preceded the uprising vanished and gave way to, again, the largest protest movement in Iraq history since its inception 100 years ago.
Thanks. We'll take one more question, and then we'll go to break.
Thanks so much. I'm Ashley. I'm a senior risk analyst for Xlog Global. Hi, I'll stand so you can see me. So this is a question for Alex. If I'm interpreting you correctly, it sounds like Iran and the government have a choice between sort of adventurism and continued involvement in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and spending the money that they spend in those places at home. So what do you think it will take for a protest movement, as these things have kind of continued to simmer and occasionally erupt into unrest? What do you think it'll take for those people, that leaderless movement, to convince the government to make those changes and to spend that money that they're spending in the region at home, or come up with other means to appease the protesters?
Thank you for that question. Look, much will depend on what happens in the region too, and what much will happen. Obviously, Iran is not operating in a vacuum. They respond or take advantage of realities on the ground. If you look at the last 40 years, Iranian foreign policy so-called success stories have all happened in places where there's been vacuum. In Lebanon in the early 80s, they created Hezbollah. In Iraq, the United States went in and gave them an opportunity to become the kingmakers they are today. And on with the Palestinians, Hamas. So make sure, one, you don't have vacuum, because if there's vacuum, the Iranian regime is always tempted. But even when they're tempted, when they get engaged, as we find out now, they have to pay a price for it, and increasingly a price they can't really justify anymore. The Iranian protesters are focused on, of course, they're focused on the foreign policy part, because they see this project in the Arab world to be never ending. You know, Iran, on the one hand, is extremely protective of its borders. And yet, when it comes to its own power projection, it ignores those international borders. It seems to me the Iranian protesters are saying, we have no business interfering in the way we do today, when you have Qasem Soleimani land in the green zone in a helicopter to decide what's going to happen in Iraqi politics. That is not sort of healthy interstate relation. I think Iranian people will want to see, and the protesters, I'm sure most of them would want to see, trade, commerce, healthy relations. And if there are no menacing threats like ISIS was posing to Iran in 2014, or if you don't have another neighboring state sort of threaten Iran, then it becomes harder for the Iranian regime not to want to go in the path of reducing their interferences and turning to a mainstream type of relationship with their neighbors. But remember, because we would be kidding ourselves if we sat here in this room in the winter of 2019 and claimed everything that goes wrong in the Middle East is Iran's fault. It's not true. The Iranians are at fault, in my view, at a lot. But their biggest crime, again, to go back to your point about the protesters, is that they're ignoring the rights and desires of their own people in many ways. And they're playing these games in the region. They have done it for a long time. They got away with it, as I said before, when the price of oil was 110, 150, and you had billions of dollars come in. When that money is not coming in, what do you do with the limited resources you have? I think it's really a big moment of a test for the regime. And not only that, the demographic is changing. The younger generation are not interested in the sort of slogans of Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979. They want to be in a different part of the, on a different path in this world than they are today. And time will show what the regime will do, whether they're going to go with repression or they're actually going to soften up and start listening to their own people.
Thank you. Any final comments? Okay, well, I really appreciate the great overview of the region, and we'll give them a round of applause. And then we have, yeah.